The front desk at Blackwork Tattoo Company smelled like green soap and coffee gone cold, and Odessa Farrow liked it that way. Predictable smells. Predictable Tuesdays. She'd built her whole life out of things that didn't change without warning, and a tattoo shop of all places gave her that. People came in wanting something permanent, something they'd chosen on purpose, and she got to be the one who wrote it down, confirmed the appointment, told them where to sit. Control in small doses. It was enough. She rubbed her thumb over the inside of her left wrist without meaning to, an old habit worn smooth as a stone in a pocket. The mark there was small, no bigger than a thumbnail. 2 interlocking half circles inside a thin diamond border, faded to the soft gray blue of something inked decades ago. She'd had it since before she had a name. The Delaware County case file, the only document that existed of her first 4 years on Earth, listed it under distinguishing marks, origin unknown, the same clinical language used for a birthmark or a scar. Nobody had traced it. Nobody had asked. By the time she was old enough to ask herself, she'd learned that some questions just circled back empty, and every circle back empty cost you something. She'd stopped paying that cost around age 16. It was easier. The bell over the door gave its tin rattle at 2:40, and a man walked in who made the whole shop recalibrate around him without doing anything as obvious as raising his voice. He wore a charcoal overcoat that had never seen off the rack, and he moved like someone used to rooms opening for him before he reached the door. 2 men waited outside on the sidewalk, not quite guarding him, not quite not. "I have a 2:45 with Ren," he said. "Touch up." Odessa clicked through the schedule, found the name, and Bratsev, and gestured him toward the waiting bench. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, unbuttoning his cuff with the unhurried precision of a man who did nothing carelessly, and rolled his sleeve to the elbow to check the piece Ren would be reworking, some geometric shoulder-to-forearm design catching afternoon light. That was when Odessa saw it. Just above the inside of his wrist, small, faded to the same soft gray blue as her own, 2 interlocking half circles inside a diamond border. Her pen stopped moving on the appointment book. She'd seen 1,000 tattoos cross that desk. She knew, in the specific way only someone who works around ink for years knows, that no 2 freehand pieces line up by accident. Not the spacing, not the exact angle where the diamond's corner clipped the left half circle a few degrees short of symmetric. A flaw repeated so precisely it couldn't be a flaw. It was the same hand. The same stencil maybe. The same something. She didn't decide to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do, before the part of her that managed consequences could get a vote. "I have the same tattoo as you." He turned his wrist over first, like he needed to confirm what she meant before he'd let himself hear it. Then he looked up. Odessa had clocked, in 3 years of watching strangers walk through that door, every version of startled a face could do. This wasn't that. This was a man going still the way people go still when a floor they'd trusted for years turns out to be thinner than they thought. No flinch, no visible motion at all, just a stillness that took effort to hold. His eyes went to her wrist and stayed there long enough that she instinctively covered the mark with her other hand, an old reflex from childhood, from caseworkers who used to point at it like it was evidence in a trial no one would explain to her. "Where?" he said. Not a full question. Barely a word. "I don't know." The honesty surprised her more than his reaction had. "I've had it since I was found. Nobody's ever known." He didn't answer. He looked toward the back of the shop, toward Rin coming out to greet him, and something crossed his face. A decision arriving too fast, being shelved on purpose. "I have to reschedule," he said, already turning for the door, already reaching for his phone without dialing anything, just holding it like ballast. "Something's come up." The bell rattled again. Through the front window, Odessa watched him say something short to the 2 men on the sidewalk, watched one of them glance back at the shop with an expression she couldn't read from that distance, watched the 3 of them get into a black car that pulled away like it had somewhere urgent to be. Rin came up beside her, frowning at the empty appointment slot. "That's weird. He's never cancelled in 4 years." Odessa didn't answer. She was still looking at her own wrist, at the mark she'd spent a lifetime not asking about, and for the first time in longer than she could name she wanted to ask. He came back 2 days later, and this time he didn't wait for an appointment. It was a slow Thursday, rain streaking the windows, and Odessa was restocking the aftercare display when the bell rang, and she looked up to find him already halfway to the desk, coat dark with rain at the shoulders, moving like he'd rehearsed this walk the whole drive over and abandoned the rehearsal somewhere around the door. "Nikolai Bratsev," he said, which she already knew from the schedule but understood now was an offering, not information. I need to ask you some questions. If you're willing. About my tattoo. About you. Odessa glanced toward the back where Rin was working on a client, then nodded toward the small break room behind the desk. 3 chairs, a coffee maker older than she was, a window that looked out on the alley. She led him there because the front desk wasn't a place for whatever this was, and because some part of her had already decided, against every foster system instinct telling her not to, that she wanted to hear it. He sat like a man and used to sitting in rooms he didn't own. How old are you? 29. Do you know your birth date? An actual one or an assigned one? Assigned. I was found when I was maybe 3, maybe 4. The doctors estimated. County gave me a birthday close to when I was found, since there wasn't one on record. She'd said this sentence so many times across so many forms it had lost its edges years ago. Saying it to him, it had edges again. Why? He didn't answer that yet. Where were you found? A church steps outside Scranton. No note. No, she stopped herself before the word nothing because it wasn't quite true anymore. Not with him sitting across from her holding his own wrist like it had started aching. Why does this matter to you? Nikolai exhaled, and for a moment the careful architecture of his composure had a crack in it, small and human. That mark is not a tattoo shop's design. It's a private family symbol. It goes back to my grandfather. Every direct descendant gets it in infancy before they can remember getting it. Tradition, not choice. He turned his own wrist so the ink caught the gray light from the window. I have had this since before I could walk. There are perhaps 30 living people in the world who carry it. I know most of their faces. Odessa's pulse did something complicated. You're saying I might be, what, one of them? I'm saying I had a cousin, he said, and his voice thinned on the word cousin in a way that told her this was old grief, not new information. Born the same year I was. She vanished from the family before either of us could remember each other. I was told as a boy not to ask what happened. I didn't ask. Children learn that quickly when to stop asking. He looked at her directly then and it cost him something visible to keep doing it. I'm not saying I know who you are. I'm saying the dates align in a way I can't call coincidence and still sleep tonight. The break room felt very small suddenly, the rain very loud against the glass. Odessa had spent 25 years building a wall around the specific hope of family, not because she didn't want one, but because wanting one and not having it was a wound that reopened every time she let herself touch it. She recognized, with a kind of dread she hadn't expected, that this man was handing her a reason to touch it again. I don't have records, she said carefully. Just the county file. A caseworker's guesses. That's all there's ever been. I have records, Nikolai said. Or I intend to. My grandfather kept everything. Every birth, every placement, every decision the family made about its own. If there's a truth here, it exists on paper somewhere, and I will find it before I ask you to believe anything you don't want to believe yet. It should have sounded controlling. Instead it sounded like the first careful thing anyone had done around her wound in years. Go slow, verify first, don't hand her hope until it could hold weight. She studied him, this stranger with her tattoo and her exact unasked questions, and made a decision she'd regret if it went wrong and would never forgive herself for not making if it went right. Then find it, she said. But I need you to understand something. I've had people promise me family before. Foster placements that were supposed to be permanent. A caseworker who said she'd find my birth mother and then transferred counties before she did. I don't fall for promises anymore. I fall for proof. Something in his expression shifted, not offense, something closer to respect. Good, he said. I don't trust people who fall for promises either. Proof then. He stood, buttoning his coat against the return trip into the rain and paused at the break room door. May I come back? Not for the shop. For this. Odessa looked at her wrist one more time, at the mark that had been a mystery for 25 years and might impossibly stop being one. Yeah, she said. You can come back. He left the way he'd arrived, quiet, purposeful, but this time she noticed, watching him go, that one of the men waiting outside caught his eye through the window and asked something with just his eyebrows. Nikolai shook his head once, sharp, and the man's expression didn't fully smooth back out before he turned away. Whatever this was, someone else had already noticed it too. He came back 4 more times over the next 2 weeks, and each visit peeled back one more layer of a life Odessa had never let herself imagine belonged to her. He brought a folder the third time, thin but growing. A photocopy of a birth ledger page in handwriting too formal to be modern. A family tree sketched by hand with names crossed out and added over decades. A photograph of an infant's arm with the same diamond mark tattooed fresh and dark. My grandfather documented everything, he explained, spreading the pages across a cafe table 3 blocks from the shop, chosen because it was public enough to feel safe and quiet enough to talk. He believed the family survived by remembering exactly who belonged to it. This page, he tapped the ledger photocopy, records a birth the same year as mine. A girl. The entry ends here. His finger stopped on a line where the ink simply broke off, no closing details, the kind of absence that only meant something to someone who knew what should have followed it. Ends how? No death record. No marriage record, obviously given the age. No further mention anywhere in 30 years of family papers. He said it steadily, but Odessa was learning to read the tells beneath his stillness, a tightness at his jaw when the subject touched grief he hadn't processed. People don't simply stop existing in records. Someone stops recording them. She traced the crossed-out name on the family tree with one finger, careful, like it might smudge. You said your cousin vanished. You never asked what happened. I asked once. I was maybe 9. My grandfather told me some doors once closed protect people by staying closed. I believed him because I was 9 and because he was not a man you argued with. Nikolai's mouth tightened. I've spent 3 weeks wondering if I was protected from a truth, or if the truth was protected from me. The distinction mattered more than he probably realized he was revealing. Odessa understood with a clarity that startled her, that whatever answer this search produced, it would cost him something too, not just her. That made this different from every other time someone had gone looking for her past. This time the looking wounded both directions. Their next meeting he mentioned Pavle for the first time. Casually, the way you mention a family fixture so constant you forget strangers don't already know the name. My grandfather's oldest associate. He's handled the family's private matters for 40 years. Legal work, difficult conversations, things that never touch outside lawyers. Nikolai frowned over his coffee, an idea visibly forming as he spoke it. He would have been the one entrusted with a matter like this. If anyone besides my grandfather knew what happened to my cousin, it's him. Have you asked him? Not yet. A pause waited. I want documentation before I ask Pavle anything. He is very good at making inconvenient questions disappear. It was the first note of real caution Odessa had heard from him, and it planted something uneasy in her that grew over the following days. She found herself against every self-protective habit she'd built, wanting this to be true, wanting a grandfather's ledger and a family tree and a stranger's careful proof-gathering to add up to you were never actually alone, you were just misplaced. Wanting it scared her more than not having it ever had. Hope she was relearning was its own kind of dangerous. The setback arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not by Nikolai but by a call to the shop from a number she didn't recognize. A man's voice, polished and unhurried, asking to speak with the young woman handling the Bratsev inquiry, as though she were a case file instead of a person. This is Pavle Sorokin, he said once she'd confirmed it was her. I understand you and Nikolai have been in contact regarding a family matter. I'd like to meet. Clarify a few things, for everyone's protection. Something in the phrase for everyone's protection sat wrong in her chest, cold and specific, the exact shape of every institutional voice that had ever managed her life instead of helping it. She agreed to meet him anyway because refusing felt like admitting she had something to hide and she didn't. She should have trusted the cold feeling. Pavle Sorokin chose a restaurant too formal for a Tuesday afternoon, and he was already seated when Odessa arrived, a folder of his own closed neatly on the white tablecloth in front of him. He had the kind of face that had learned decades ago to give nothing away, pleasant, unremarkable, patient in a way that felt rehearsed. Miss Farrow. Thank you for coming. He didn't stand. I'll be direct since I suspect you'd prefer that. I've reviewed the situation you and Nikolai have been discussing, and I have concerns. What kind of concerns? The kind that come from decades of watching families get taken advantage of. He opened the folder, turned it so she could see a page of notes in his own hand. Dates, her name, a summary of the shop's public information, the county case number she'd never told anyone but Nikolai. He'd gotten it somewhere else, and the casual way he displayed that fact was its own kind of threat. A resemblance in a tattoo is not evidence, Miss Farrow. It's an opportunity, and opportunities attract people who know how to use them. I'd hate to see you make choices you can't walk back once the family realizes you have no real claim. Odessa kept her hands flat on the table, steady on purpose. I never asked for a claim. He came to me. He's grieving a cousin he barely remembers and easily led by anything that resembles her returning. It happens to be you. Pavle's voice never rose, which made it worse. I'm offering you a way out before this becomes public and unpleasant. A settlement quietly in exchange for ending contact. No accusations. No records. Everyone protected. It took her a full breath to understand she was being bribed to disappear. The exact thing she realized with sick clarity, that might have already happened to her once, engineered by someone exactly like the man across the table. She stood, chair scraping, folder still closed in front of him like a door he thought he'd already won behind. I don't want your money, she said. I want the truth, whatever it turns out to be. If that's nothing, I'll live with nothing. I've done it for 25 years. But I'm not disappearing quietly for your convenience. She left before he could answer, hands shaking once she was out of his sightline, and called Nikolai from the sidewalk, voice tighter than she wanted it to be. He didn't recognize the restaurant's staged politeness as anything but alarming. He offered you money to walk away? He knew my case number. Nobody has that except me and you. The silence on the line lasted long enough that she heard him make a decision in it. I need to see my grandfather's private papers. Not the family ledger. His personal correspondence kept separately that Pavle has always managed access to. If Pavle is this eager to end this before it starts, there's something in those papers he doesn't want found. It took him 3 days, and when he called her back his voice had a different register entirely, controlled in the specific way of someone holding something enormous very carefully so it doesn't break before he can show it to the right person. I found it, he said. A letter in Pavle's own handwriting addressed to my grandfather, dated the year the ledger entry breaks off. He wrote that a placement had been arranged, his word, for an infant whose existence, if it survived to adulthood, threatened his own branch's inheritance position. He called it protecting the family's stability. He called it, in his own hand, necessary. Nikolai's voice thinned on the last word, grief and fury both audible underneath the control. It wasn't abandonment, Odessa. It wasn't an accident or a mother who couldn't cope, or any of the stories you were probably given to explain the unexplainable. You were removed. Deliberately. By someone who is still, right now, trying to make sure it stays buried. Odessa sat down hard on the edge of her bed, the phone pressed so tight to her ear it hurt. 25 years of maybe I wasn't wanted collapsing under the much heavier weight of I was wanted enough to be a threat. It should have felt like relief. It felt like grief for a childhood that had been taken from her on purpose by a man who'd sat across a restaurant table from her 3 days ago offering to pay her to disappear again. What happens now? She asked and heard in her own voice, the sound of someone about to make a decision she couldn't undo. Now, Nikolai said, Pavle finds out that the door he spent decades keeping closed is about to open whether he's ready or not. Pavle moved faster than either of them expected. Nikolai called 2 days later from an airport, his voice clipped with an urgency Odessa hadn't heard from him before. Pavle booked a flight to Zurich this morning. Private. He's never done that without informing the family first. It's how he's stayed useful for 40 years, always accountable, always visible. He's running. Running means he knows you found something. It means he knows exactly what I found, and he's choosing exile over explanation. A pause tight with calculation. I'm at the airport now. Security won't stop him without cause, and family business isn't cause. I need something that is. The pressure Odessa felt building over the following hours wasn't abstract anymore. It had a flight number and a departure gate. She spent the afternoon at the shop unable to focus, Rin eventually taking over her desk shift without being asked, watching her with the careful concern of someone who'd noticed something had changed in her weeks ago and was finally seeing the cost of it land. The blow came from a different direction entirely. Nikolai called again just after 5, and this time his voice had lost its composure completely. The elders know, he said. Someone told them before I could. I don't know how, I don't know who, but 3 of the family's senior members called an emergency meeting for tonight, and Pavle's already spoken to 2 of them. He's telling them I've been deceived by an opportunist. That you manufactured the tattoo resemblance, that the ledger page is being misread, that I'm too emotionally compromised by an old grief to think clearly. His voice cracked on the last part, not from doubt in her but from fury at being outmaneuvered on ground he'd thought he controlled. If I can't get Proof and Pavle in the same room as the elders tonight, they'll believe the version that costs them nothing to believe. And Pavle will be in Zurich by morning. Then get him in the room. He's already through security. Odessa closed her eyes, the shop's fluorescent hum suddenly very loud, and understood that the version of this story where she stayed safely on the sidelines while other people fought her battle had just ended. I'm coming, she said. You said the tattoo is proof enough to make you believe me the first day you saw it. Maybe it's proof enough for a room of people who've known your grandfather's rules their whole lives. Odessa, this room will not be gentle. If Pavle convinces them first. I've survived rooms that weren't gentle my whole life, she said, and heard her own voice steady in a way that surprised her. I'm not asking for gentle. I'm asking to be believed on the same terms you were the first day you saw my wrist. The drive to the family estate took 40 minutes she spent mostly silent, watching the city thin into wooded roads, aware of every mile as a mile closer to either the family she'd never had or the final, worst confirmation that hope had been a mistake again. Nikolai met her at the gate, having abandoned the airport chase for a call to the estate's private security instead. A decision, he told her grimly, that meant Pavle might still make his flight, but the room tonight mattered more than the man running from it. I have the letter, he said, folder in hand, jaw set. I have the ledger page. I have you. Inside, the estate's great room held 4 elders around a long table, faces set in the particular skepticism of people who had outlived several decades of family drama and trusted very little of it on arrival. Pavle's absence from the room, confirmed moments later by a text that he had indeed boarded, sat over the gathering like a held breath, an empty chair that argued its own case simply by being empty. Odessa stepped forward before anyone could ask her to, sleeve already pushed back, wrist bare under the room's low light. You don't have to believe a stranger, she said, voice steadier than she felt. But I think you'll believe your own family's mark. The eldest of the 4, a woman with silver hair pinned severely back and eyes that had clearly buried more family secrets than she'd ever spoken aloud, rose from her chair and crossed the room without a word. She took Odessa's wrist in both hands gently, the way you'd hold something you were afraid might be fragile and afraid might not be, and studied the mark under the lamp with the specific attention of someone comparing it against a memory decades old. I tattooed this mark myself, the woman said finally, quiet enough that the room went stiller to hear it. Every child in this family for 40 years by my own hand. I would know my own line work anywhere in any light on any skin. Her thumb traced the small clipped corner of the diamond, the flaw Odessa had noticed the very first day. This clip, here, I remember making this exact correction on an infant girl. I remember because it was the last piece I ever did before Pavle told me the child had been placed elsewhere for her own safety, and I was never permitted to ask where. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing about this family, Odessa was learning, moved dramatically, but the skepticism in 4 faces cracked open into something closer to horror, the specific horror of realizing you've spent decades trusting a story that was never true. Placed elsewhere for her safety, one of the other elders repeated, tasting the phrase like it had gone rancid. Pavle told the entire family that the infant had died shortly after birth. That is the story we have carried for 25 years. Nikolai set the folder on the table, opened it without ceremony, and let the letter speak for itself. Pavle's handwriting, Pavle's own words, arranged and necessary and protecting the family's stability, sitting in stark contradiction to the story he'd told everyone in that room for a quarter-century. He lied to all of us, Nikolai said. Not to protect the family. To protect his own branch's inheritance position, which is threatened the moment a direct descendant with a stronger claim reappears. The eldest woman was still holding Odessa's wrist, and something in her grip changed. No longer just examining, now holding on. What is your name, child? Odessa. Odessa Farrow. You have your grandfather's mother's eyes, the woman said, and it wasn't proof, not in any way a court would recognize, but it broke something loose in the room anyway. The elders leaning in now, one of them already reaching for the family tree Nikolai had spread across the table, tracing the broken line where a name had been crossed out decades ago and finding for the first time, somewhere for it to reconnect. Odessa felt the moment arrive the way she imagined drowning people describe finally reaching air. Not gentle, not soft, almost too much all at once. 25 years of case files that ended in shrugs, of caseworkers who ran out of budget before they ran out of questions, of a mark on her wrist that had never meant anything to anyone but her. And now 4 strangers who shared her blood were rearranging their understanding of their own family history around the fact that she existed. "He's not just running from a lie," Nikolai said into the charged, quiet voice, hard now. The grief from days earlier hardened into resolve. "He arranged the disappearance of a 2-year-old to protect money. That is not a family matter to be handled quietly. That is a decision this family needs to answer with everything it has." The eldest woman released Odessa's wrist at last, straightened, and turned to the others with the finality of someone who had made up her mind and intended the room to follow. "Then we don't let him answer for it in Zurich," she said. "We bring him back." Pavle's flight had a layover in New York, a detail the family's private security team confirmed within the hour, and a detail that gave Nikolai exactly the window he needed. He didn't fly out to intercept him. He didn't need to. For generations of family influence made 2 phone calls sufficient. One to hold Pavle's connecting flight under a manufactured documentation issue, one to have him quietly met at the gate by men who worked for people Pavle himself had spent 40 years protecting. He was brought back to the estate the following evening, and the room he walked into was not the room he'd left that morning believing he controlled. "You told me she died," the eldest elder said before Pavle had fully crossed the threshold. No greeting, no preamble, the letter already on the table facing him. "For 25 years, you told this family a 2-year-old girl died, and we grieved a child you had quietly placed in a stranger's care to protect your own branch's inheritance." Pavle's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to see the letter's handwriting was his own. "Then it didn't hold at all. I did what was necessary to protect this family from a succession dispute that would have torn it apart," he said, and Odessa recognized in the specific desperation under his words, a man who had told himself this justification so many times he half believed it. The inheritance structure couldn't survive a competing direct line. "I made a decision that kept this family whole." "You made a decision that stole a child from her grandmother's arms," Nikolai said, and the fury in his voice was quiet, which made it worse than shouting would have. "You let her grow up with no name, no history, no one, because it was convenient for your accounting. Don't call that protection." Odessa, standing at the edge of the room, found she didn't need to say anything. This wasn't her fight to argue. It was the family's own history colliding with the lie it had lived inside for a quarter-century, and every word landing in that room was landing on people who had trusted Pavle for decades and were now watching that trust collapse in real time. She'd expected, walking in, to feel triumphant. She felt instead a strange, heavy grief. For the 4-year-old on the church steps who'd never known any of this was happening, for the childhood that had already been lived and couldn't be given back no matter how thoroughly Pavle was exposed tonight. "The inheritance," the eldest elder said, voice like a door closing, "was never yours to protect at the cost of a child's entire life. You will answer to this family's council formally for what you've done, and you will not set foot on family property again until you have." She turned from Pavle entirely, dismissing him with her attention rather than her words, and looked instead at Odessa, standing quiet at the room's edge. "Come here, child. You should not be standing at the back of your own family's house." Pavle was led out by the same men who'd retrieved him from the airport, his protests trailing behind him, thinner with every step, until the great room's heavy door closed on the sound of them entirely. Whatever consequences the family's council decided on, Odessa understood, would unfold slowly, formally, in ways that had nothing to do with her. His punishment belonged to the family he'd betrayed, not to her. What belonged to her was the room that remained once he was gone. For elders, a family tree with a name no longer crossed out, and Nikolai standing beside her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something like relief finally allowed to surface after weeks of careful control. "It's done," he said, quiet enough that it was just for her. "The part that needed proving is proven." Odessa looked down at her wrist, at the mark that had been an unanswered question for 25 years and was, as of tonight, answered completely. Not a mystery anymore, not evidence of nothing, but evidence of exactly who she'd always been. "It's not done," she said, and found she was smiling for the first time in the whole strange ordeal. "I think it's just starting." 3 months later, Odessa still worked the front desk at Blackwork Tattoo Company, because it turned out she liked the job for its own sake, Not just for the control it used to offer her. Though she'd noticed, without needing to examine it too hard, that she didn't reach for that particular kind of control as often anymore. She had other things steadying her now. She had Sunday dinners at the estate, chaotic in a way she was still learning the rhythm of, full of cousins who argued about nothing and grandmother figures who corrected her posture and an eldest elder who'd taken, without asking permission, to calling her my girl in a tone that made something in Odessa's chest loosen every single time. She had a family tree with her name written in, not crossed out, in ink that would never need explaining to a stranger again. She had a case file, closed now for good, replaced by documents that told the truth instead of guessing at it. She had Nikolai, though that part had built itself slowly, the way the best things did. Not the storming, obvious romance she might once have expected from a man who'd gone rigid at the sight of her wrist, but something built out of 3 months of him showing up, of careful questions that never demanded more than she was ready to give, of a partnership that had started with a shared search for the truth and hadn't stopped being a partnership once the truth was found. He still checked in on her most days, not out of obligation anymore but out of something that had become habit and then become want. "You're staring at your wrist again," he said one evening, finding her on the estate's back terrace where she'd taken to sitting when the noise of family gatherings needed a quiet edge to breathe against. He sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and she noted, the way she noted small good things now, that she didn't flinch from the closeness anymore. "I used to hate looking at it," she said. "It was just a question I couldn't answer. Now she searched for the word, found it. It's the only thing that was ever mine and true at the same time this whole time. I just didn't know it yet." Nikolai turned his own wrist over, laid it beside hers on the stone railing, the 2 marks matching in the porch light exactly as they had the first day, except now the matching meant something neither of them had to explain to anyone ever again. "My grandmother," he said, the elder who'd first confirmed the tattoo, who Odessa had learned in the past months to call by that name without hesitation, "wants to redo the piece properly. Says the original deserves better than a shaky infant's arm and 40 years of fading." "Will it look different?" "No," he said, and the certainty in it settled something in her that had been unsettled her whole life. "Same mark. Same family. Just clearer now. That's all restoration ever really does. Doesn't change what something is. Just makes it easier to see." Odessa looked out at the estate grounds, dusk settling gold over lawns she was still learning belonged to her too, and thought about the 4-year-old on the church steps who'd carried a mystery on her wrist for 25 years without ever knowing it was actually a promise, deliberately buried but never actually broken. She thought about how close the whole truth had come to staying buried forever. One skipped tattoo appointment, one client who chose a different shop, one moment where she might not have said the sentence that changed everything. She hadn't overthought it. She just said the true thing when it arrived. "I have the same tattoo as you," she said again, now quieter, not a revelation this time but something closer to a vow, and watched Nikolai's face do the thing it did now instead of going rigid, soften entirely the way a door does when it finally, after decades, gets to stay open. "Would you have said it too? The true thing out loud, even knowing it might unravel everything you thought you understood about where you came from? Or would the fear of being wrong have kept you silent?" Thank you for reading. If this story found you, I hope the next one finds you too.